All right, so we've looked at a lot of history of psychology, but the purpose of the video today is going to be, okay, if I'm a psychologist right now, today, in 2015, how do I analyze behavior mental processes? Do I use the pre-scientific or scientific history of psych, or is there something completely different? And it's actually a little bit of both. So we're going to be looking at what we call the Big 8 contemporary perspectives or approaches to psychology. And you should have a graphic organizer that you picked up in class today. If you want to use that now, you can. So what are the approaches to psychology, or the perspectives, or the lenses? They are just 8 different ways, 8 different filters that you can use to look at behavior and mental processes. And I like using the term lenses because I think, if you've ever seen National Treasure, how he uses those special glasses that they have like 3 lenses on them, and he has 1 lens up and 1 lens down, he can see something, and then he puts another lens down, he can see something. So what he sees is totally dependent on what lens he is looking through. And it's the same with psychology. You could look at a behavior 8 different ways from 8 of these different perspectives and see 8 different things. And so that's kind of why we use that term. So the first lens is the neuroscience perspective. And yes, I'm going to wear lenses during this video to accentuate my point. So if you're a psychologist that's using the neuroscience perspective, you are only looking at behavior with its organic root. What is going on inside of the body physically that could be attributing to the behavior or causing the behavior. So you might be looking at neurotransmitters and nerve function. You might look at hormones, because we all know that hormones can definitely impact behavior. You might be looking at any drugs that the person might be on, any brain deformities, anything that the person ate or drank that could be affecting their behavior, anything physiological from the body out. The neuroscience perspective is also nice because it is observable. So, for example, if someone has Alzheimer's disease, clearly their behavior is different than what it should be. There's an organic biological root. Their brain is shrinking because of the Alzheimer's disease. So, an example for how to apply this perspective. We're going to use Miley Cyrus as our running example here. So, a lot of people will just look at Miley Cyrus and say, wow, she's crazy, or maybe when specifically her Wrecking Ball video came out, wow, she's crazy, right? But if I'm a psychologist looking through the biological lens, no longer can I define her as crazy. I need to be looking at what possibly could be going on inside of her body that's causing the behavior to happen. And so maybe there's a neurotransmitter malfunction in her brain that's causing her to act the way she's acting. Or maybe she's on drugs and that's causing her to act the way that she's acting. But as a biological or neuroscience psychologist, I can't just say she's crazy or that it's the culture or that it's her unconscious desires. It's everything biological. The second lens is the evolutionary perspective, and this perspective deals with what do we as humans pass down in our genetic code that helps us survive. So we will look at a behavior and we'll evaluate it based upon how is this behavior helping us survive as a species. Or how does it ensure that we're able to reproduce so that we can continue our species? So a good example that I have is, if some of you have ever babysat little kids before, and as soon as the parents leave, the kid cries hysterically, even though you might have babysat them like 10,000 times, but they still will cry every time mom and dad leave. That's an evolutionary response to aid in survival. They want to be by their parents because evolutionarily that's where they would have the best chance of survival. So if we take our Miley Cyrus example, rather than calling her crazy, an evolutionary psychologist might say, well, she just thought that by swinging naked on a wrecking ball, that would help her attract a mate and thus ensure the species survival of the human race. So you can see it's very different from the biological perspective where they said maybe she's on drugs or maybe her neurotransmitters are off. The evolutionary psychologist says, no, she's trying to get the attention of a male. Another good example of evolutionary psychology, it helps explain why we find blue eyes attractive. So you may be with somebody that has brown eyes, but the majority of people will say that just blue eyes are mesmerizing. They're especially like really deep blue eyes are so attractive. Well, why is that? The reason is because we can see pupils better in a blue eye versus a brown eye or a green eye. And when you're around somebody that you're attracted to, your pupils will dilate, they'll expand. And that's easier to see in somebody with blue eyes, so you're able to see better if they're liking you, if they're not liking you, and so you find them much more attractive because your body's able to respond better to the cues from the other body. So it's not a sociocultural preference, it's not an unconscious desire or preference, it's an evolutionary preference. The third psychological lens is the behavior genetics perspective, and this perspective is basically the nature or nurture perspective in psychology. It seeks to know how much of that behavior came from your environment, from growing up, and how much of it is reflecting the way you were born. So did you get things inherited from your parents? So they study twins a lot to see how much their behavior is different and how much their behavior is the same based off of genetics. So if we look at Miley Cyrus, rather than calling her crazy, a behavior genetic psychologist would look at what things did her parents do that she's also doing? What things are her siblings doing that she's also doing? Is there a connection between the two or not? Is it nurture or is it nature? So that's a pretty simple perspective. It's really just deciding what part of the behavior is nature or nurture. The fourth lens is the cognitive perspective, and this perspective deals all with how you think. Because let's be real, how you perceive situations can deeply impact your behavior. So for example, if I accidentally kick you in the face tomorrow in class really, really hard, and you legitimately perceive that to be an accident, like I did not mean to do it, it was just a horrible accident, you're going to react a lot differently than if I intentionally went up and kicked you in the face, right? So the way our thoughts work plays a huge part in our behavior. So if we are going to use our Miley Cyrus example, rather than calling her crazy, a cognitive psychologist would seriously try and understand what she was thinking that allowed her to create the Wrecking Ball music video, would seriously ask what she's thinking with all of her latest media stunts, and truly try and understand maybe she did think that was the best way to articulate what she wanted to project to her fans. I mean, so it's all about thought process. The fifth lens is the behavioral perspective, and we talked about this in class, but this comes from the behavioral school of thought. So this type of psychologist only looks at the external push and pull factors that influence your behavior. If you do something, they're not going to ask you what you were thinking when it happened. They're only going to look at what externally influenced that behavior. So this includes rewards and punishment, watching others and mimicking their behavior. An example is, sometimes in school you'll have kids who disrupt the class all the time and it's super annoying. Well, a lot of times those kids really just want attention, and every time the teacher goes over there, that's positive reinforcement. It's a reward, so their behavior continues. Another example is biting your nails. A behavioral psychologist would never ask you, what's making you anxious that's making you want to bite your nails? They're just going to say, slap on some really nasty tasting nail polish and don't bite your nails anymore. They're going to try and fix the behavior, nothing with your mental process. So if we look at our Miley Cyrus example, rather than calling her crazy, a behavioral psychologist might ask, how much money did someone pay her to make this music video? Or did she do this to avoid punishment? Or did she see someone else do it and that inspired her, so she's mimicking the behavior? So any of those things would be how we would evaluate Miley Cyrus in this perspective. Lens number 6 is the humanistic perspective, and we also talked about this in class today as well. It comes from the humanistic school of thought, where these psychologists believe that everybody is essentially good, and they're all on this journey to self-actualize. So I showed you a picture of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and here it is again. But as we try and self-actualize, the things below that very top rung here help influence our behavior. So for example, if I'm really mad at somebody at school, a kid who maybe cheats on an exam or something, and I really, really want to punch them in the face, I know that if I punch them in the face, that's going to have some serious negative consequences for me, and I'm not going to be able to self-actualize very well. Another example is, I think I mentioned this in class as well, but if a kid is not doing well in class, it could be because they're starving and they are not meeting these bottom physiological needs here that would allow them to self-actualize. So you're always trying to move up this pyramid, and you need the bottom one before you can move up to the second one. You need the second one before you can move up to the third one, and so on and so forth. So in Miley's situation, rather than calling her crazy, a humanistic perspective psychologist might see this as a cry for help in terms of her feeling love and belongingness, because she has to put herself out there naked for everybody else to see. Or maybe it's a self-esteem issue. Maybe she feels great with her body image and is okay with it. Maybe she doesn't, and it's a way to push herself. I don't know. This is kind of a stretch. But so a lot of times these perspectives don't necessarily have to fit the situation and make sense, but they just need to fit the perspective. All right, 2 more to go. So the 7th lens is the psychodynamic perspective, and we also talked about this in class with Freud, and it's essentially the same thing. It's the focus on the unconscious mind, so a psychodynamic psychologist would only be looking at the unconscious factors. It talks a lot about repression, and so psychodynamic psychologists believe that oftentimes really traumatic, bad things can happen to us in childhood, and we repress them down into our unconscious, where we try not to think about them, and eventually we truly do forget about them, but that every now and then those feelings come back, and they impact our behavior even though we might not be aware of it. So an example would be, there's an adult man who has intimacy issues. He doesn't want to have a romantic relationship. He doesn't want to have any friendships. A psychodynamic psychologist might look into his past and ask, maybe was he bullied when he was younger and he was so scarred by that bullying that caused him to have fear in getting close to others, and so it's currently affecting him now even though it happened a long time ago. So in Miley's case, rather than calling her crazy, a psychodynamic psychologist, and I apologize, I haven't changed the lens here, but a psychodynamic psychologist might say, oh, she dreamt about it, and she decided that since her dreams are really the fulfillment of her true wishes, that she needed to make this video because it was in her dream. So the 8th and final perspective is the sociocultural lens, and this basically says that our behavior is dictated a lot by culture. Depending on what culture we live in, impacts our behavior. So some cultures will kiss each other when greeting, like in France. Some bow at each other, like in Asia. Some cultures, like in the United States here, we emphasize the individual and individual rights and doing what's best for you and what makes you happy, but that would never be the case in Asia. They're very much more group-oriented. Another example, I will never forget going to my honeymoon in the Dominican Republic, and I didn't know they were European beaches, so there's all these women from Europe that are there just walking around topless, and I just remember going, freaking out and trying to cover my husband's eyes, and it was just not a good experience, right? We would never do that here in the United States. So our culture really dictates a lot of our behavior. So it also deals with things like conformity. I thought maybe this would apply here. I'm not quite sure what Bethel's style is yet, but I'm assuming that there will be some of this winter. So if we take Miley's example, rather than calling her crazy, a sociocultural psychologist would say, look at our culture. We praise the celebrities that do these crazy, outlandish things. We give them a ton of attention. We give them a ton of money. We support their music. We support their YouTube videos and all this crazy stuff. And so why wouldn't she do something crazy like this? Our culture demands it. And so hopefully that helps you kind of understand that perspective. There's all the big eight perspectives, and for the next 3 days in class, we are going to be practicing them. So if you don't feel like you have a 100% handle on it right now, don't worry. I will help you out the next couple of days. And I will see you tomorrow.